August 1945. Japan surrenders. Its empire is gone, its leaders humbled. The Allies demand a full accounting of every imperial warship. But the paperwork is a mess. Some vessels are marked as scuttled, others as sunk. Yet Allied commanders aren't convinced. What if Japanese crews were hiding submarines, waiting to launch last-minute attacks? What if destroyers could slip away into the Pacific to raid convoys, or even continue the war from exile? With millions of Allied soldiers and prisoners still moving across Asia, even a handful of missing ships could be catastrophic. And soon the contradictions mounted. Some ships recorded as destroyed later reappeared intact. Others resurfaced, not under Japan's flag, but under the Soviets. In the chaos of surrender, what else had vanished, and why? Those fears only grew in the months ahead. In 1946 and 1947, merchantmen and auxiliaries were reported sunk by sudden explosions. Survivors swore they saw torpedo wakes. Officially, the blame fell on drifting mines, but whispers spread of Japanese submarines still at sea, striking in defiance long after the war was supposed to be over. From there, the mystery only deepened. Japan had looted treasure, gold, and artifacts across Asia, much of it still unaccounted for. Stories spread of submarines laden with stolen wealth slipping beneath the waves. Conspiracy claimed some reached South America, landing in Brazil or Peru among the Japanese diaspora. And in the most extreme tales, a secret Axis plan to establish bases in Antarctica, with Japanese subs joining German U-boats at the bottom of the world. This is the story of Japan's Ghost Fleet. August 1945. Japan's once mighty empire lay in ruins. Its navy, once the largest in the Pacific, had been annihilated in battle after battle. The proud carriers of Pearl Harbor, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, were long at the bottom of the sea. The battleships Yamato and Musashi, pride of the fleet, had been sent to watery graves. Allied occupation forces moved quickly. Every ship had to be catalogued, every logbook examined, every crew accounted for. The order was simple. Japan would never again be allowed a fleet of war. But the surrender revealed something unexpected. In harbors across Japan, dozens of smaller ships still survived. Destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and auxiliary vessels. Battered, yes, but intact. On paper, this was straightforward. In practice, it was chaos. Japanese naval officers scrambled to comply with Allied demands, but their records were fragmented. Many ships had been transferred to different commands in the last desperate months of war. Others had been damaged, repaired, then moved again. At Kure Naval Arsenal, Allied inspectors found dozens of hulls, but not the ones they expected. At Yokosuka, submarines appeared that had never been listed in surrender documents. Destroyers supposedly sunk in 1945 turned up moored and serviceable. And beyond Japan itself, the problem multiplied. Outposts from Hong Kong to Singapore were cluttered with abandoned craft. Minesweepers, merchant auxiliaries, even captured vessels from other nations lay scattered across Asia's seas. Sorting the wreckage of empire was proving nearly impossible. The Allies pressed harder. They demanded an exact tally. What had been sunk in combat, what had been scuttled, and what remained afloat. But the numbers didn't add up. Some vessels were listed in multiple categories, both destroyed and still active. Others had vanished from the record entirely. To American intelligence officers, it seemed less like confusion and more like deliberate obfuscation. Was this simply the chaos of a collapsed empire, or were Japanese officers hiding something? The concern wasn't academic. In 1945 and 1946, Allied shipping lanes were crowded. Millions of soldiers, prisoners of war, and displaced civilians were being ferried across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. A single Japanese submarine, still at large, could wreak havoc. The Allies knew Japan had experimented with radical weapons, manned suicide torpedoes, tiny one-man subs, and even the massive I-400 class, designed to carry bombers across oceans. If even a fraction of these remained at sea, they could strike at vulnerable targets. And so Allied commanders feared the unthinkable, that a fragment of the Imperial Navy had escaped surrender, preparing for a last act of defiance. The official record insisted the fleet was finished, but the contradictions remained. Ships counted twice, others never counted at all. Some said to be sunk were later sighted afloat. For the men tasked with securing the Pacific, these mysteries could not be ignored. If vessels had slipped through the cracks, where had they gone? And who still commanded them? By early 1946, Allied commanders were no longer willing to gamble. The paperwork confusion, the missing hulls, the fear of rogue submarines at sea, all of it demanded a final solution. And so, a quiet operation began. It was called Operation Road's End. The plan was simple. Every surviving Japanese submarine of value would be gathered, towed into deep water off the Goto Islands, and sunk beyond recovery. Japan's undersea fleet would be erased forever. In April 1946, more than 20 I-class submarines, massive ocean-going giants, some nearly 400 feet long, were scuttled in a single operation. Explosives detonated, torpedo doors blown open, and one by one, the submarines slipped beneath the waves. Oil slicks spread across the sea, the graves of weapons once meant to strike America itself. On paper, it was decisive. A fleet of killers destroyed in an instant, but the records told a different story. Some submarines never arrived at the rendezvous point. Others, listed as sunk in Road's End, were later reported sighted off Japanese ports. The numbers simply did not match. Were clerical errors to blame, or had a handful of Japan's most advanced submarines escaped destruction, their whereabouts never explained? Even in its attempt to close the book, Road's End opened new questions. For the Allies, the operation was meant to end a nightmare. Instead, it hinted at something darker. If not every submarine had been destroyed, where had the rest gone? Yet even after Operation Road's End, strange reports began to surface. In 1946 and 1947, merchantmen and auxiliary vessels went down suddenly in the seas around Japan, Korea, and the South China coast. Survivors spoke of sudden explosions, ships ripped apart in calm waters. Official reports blamed drifting mines, relics of a brutal naval war. The Pacific had been sown with hundreds of thousands, and many would remain lethal for decades. But not everyone was convinced. Some survivors swore they saw torpedo wakes moments before the explosions. To them, these were not accidents. They were attacks. Whispers spread through occupied Japan and among Allied crews that rogue submarines still prowled beneath the waves, crews that had refused surrender, commanders carrying out one last campaign, striking from the shadows long after their empire had fallen. No proof was ever found. No submarine ever surfaced to claim responsibility. But the stories refused to die. Were they just mines, or the ghostly hand of a navy that refused to surrender? And then another mystery emerged. By 1946, the Allies believed they had tied up loose ends. Submarines had been scuttled in Operation Road's End. Destroyers and cruisers were rusting in harbors, awaiting the torch. On paper, the Imperial Japanese Navy was finished. But then, ships began to reappear. Vessels reported destroyed in the final months of the war surfaced again, not flying the rising sun, but the red star of the Soviet Union. At Vladivostok, Allied observers noted Japanese-built destroyers now in Soviet service. Submarines once listed as sunk were seen in northern fleets. The very ships that had supposedly gone to the bottom were back, alive, and in enemy hands. How had this happened? Some historians argue it was simple. Under the surrender agreements, the Soviets received a share of captured Japanese vessels. Officially, they were reparations. But the transfer was anything but transparent. Records show that ships declared sunk in Japanese logs were instead quietly turned over to the Red Navy. Other vessels seemed to vanish from Allied rosters altogether, only to reappear years later in Soviet exercises. For Western intelligence, this raised uncomfortable questions. Had Japan deliberately misled the Allies, handing over ships in secret to their new occupiers in the north? Or had the Soviets themselves manipulated the paperwork, erasing the true origin of their acquisitions? The Cold War was just beginning, and the sight of former Japanese destroyers sailing under Soviet flags carried an ominous message. The weapons of the last war were already fueling the rivalries of the next. To conspiracy theorists, the implications were darker still. If Moscow could quietly absorb Japanese ships, could it also have sheltered rogue Japanese crews, submariners unwilling to surrender, now operating under a different master? Was the Soviet Union not only recycling Japan's fleet, but secretly extending its unfinished war against the West? Officially, the answer was no. Unofficially, the contradictions mounted. The lines between scuttled, surrendered, and stolen blurred. And once again, the question returned. Just how many Japanese ships truly disappeared in 1945? By 1946, the contradictions surrounding Japan's missing ships were no longer just about warships. A new and more tantalizing rumor began to spread, one tied not to battles, but to treasure. For years, Japan had looted Asia on an unimaginable scale. Gold, jewels, priceless artifacts, even entire collections of art and manuscripts, all taken from China, the Philippines, Malaya, and beyond. Historians estimate billions of dollars in wealth vanished into Japan's war machine. But when the empire collapsed, much of it was never recovered. Where had it gone? Some pointed to hidden caches in caves and tunnels across the Philippines. Others whispered that the missing wealth had been carried away aboard submarines in the final days of the war. Stories told of I-class subs loading crates under cover of night, gold bars sealed in watertight drums, cultural treasures crated for transport, and then silence. The submarines vanished. From there, the trail of rumor stretched across the Pacific. Tales emerged of submarines surfacing on the coasts of Brazil, Argentina, and Peru. In quiet coves, under moonlight, crews supposedly offloaded their cargo. Crates were hidden, fortunes buried, and in some versions, entire crews melted into the Japanese diaspora communities already thriving in South America. To skeptics, these were fantasies, gold fever carried into the post-war years. But for treasure hunters, the stories were irresistible. Expeditions scoured the jungles of the Andes and the coastal caves of Peru. Locals told of men speaking Japanese, arriving in remote villages in the late 1940s. Strangers who stayed married and disappeared into new lives. Was it true? Did submarines of the vanished fleet carry not weapons, but the empire's stolen wealth to secret destinations abroad? Or was it just another legend, born in the chaos of defeat? No evidence has ever been confirmed. No gold has ever been traced directly to a Japanese submarine. Yet the rumors endure, and with them, the unsettling possibility that some of Japan's missing vessels did not go to the bottom of the sea, but sailed into exile carrying not soldiers but treasure. As the years passed, the rumors grew wilder. If treasure could be carried to South America, what else might have been possible? In the late 1940s, stories began to circulate of a far more extreme destination, the frozen continent of Antarctica. The idea was not entirely new. During the war, Nazi Germany had launched expeditions to the southern ice, staking a claim they called Neuschwabenland. After the war, U-boat activity in the South Atlantic fueled speculation that German submarines had slipped away to hidden bases beneath the ice. But some tales added another twist, that Japanese submarines had joined them, that in the final days of 1945, I-class boats loaded not with treasure, but with supplies, equipment, and men, and sailed south into the most remote waters on Earth. Officially, there is no evidence, yet conspiracy theorists point to one event as proof: Operation High Jump. In 1946-47, the United States dispatched a massive naval task force to Antarctica. Dozens of ships, thousands of men, aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines. Officially, it was a scientific expedition. Unofficially, some claimed, it was a secret mission to root out an Axis presence under the ice. The operation ended abruptly after just a few months. Aircraft were lost, men were killed. The fleet returned home without explanation. To believers, this was the clash of worlds. The US Navy confronting a hidden remnant of the Axis, German and Japanese submarines operating from bases carved into the Antarctic ice. Skeptics dismiss it as fantasy. High Jump, they argue, was simply cut short by brutal weather, mechanical failures, and the logistical nightmare of operating in the polar south. But to those who chase the legend, the story is too seductive to ignore. Could Japanese submarines have truly joined German U-boats in Antarctica? Could the missing vessels of 1945 still lie entombed beneath the ice, part of a phantom fleet that never surrendered? There is no proof, only speculation fueled by fragments of testimony, unexplained maps, and the endless allure of the unknown. Yet the legend endures. In the frozen silence at the bottom of the world, some still hear the echo of engines and imagine the ghost fleet of 1945, hidden beneath the Antarctic ice. In the end, most historians agree. The mystery has more shadow than substance. The vast majority of Japan's warships were destroyed in combat, sunk by American aircraft and submarines, or deliberately scuttled after the surrender. The Allies catalogued thousands of hulls, and the paperwork, though contradictory at times, largely reflects a navy in ruins. Operation Road's End really did send Japan's surviving submarines to the bottom. The merchant sinkings of 1946 and 1947 were almost certainly drifting mines, not phantom torpedoes. And the ships seen under Soviet flags were simply transfers, reparations divided among the victors of the war. But the story refuses to die. There were enough gaps, enough contradictions, enough strange accounts to keep speculation alive. Treasure hunters still search the jungles of South America. Conspiracy theorists still speak of Antarctica and the possibility that Axis fleets found sanctuary in the ice. And across the Pacific, fishermen still tell tales of strange wakes, of silhouettes glimpsed at dusk, of ghostly ships that vanish into the waves.